Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. We are honored to have Congressman Michael Waltz with us here today. Congressman, we'll get you introduced properly in just a moment here, so hang tight. I'm Sean Sorbie. I am the Director of Veterans Outreach at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, and I'm honored to join you here today for today's discussion on the future of national security, the role of diplomacy and development, and the impact on American families. We're very pleased to have veterans from across the country participating in this exclusive conversation for veterans with Congressman Waltz. So like I said, we'll formally introduce him in just a minute. So I just want to get started here. For those who are new to the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, I want to give you a little overview of who we are and what we're all about. And while I'm doing that, some slides are going to play for you. So for those of you who are new, we are a diverse network of over 500 American businesses and humanitarian organizations, alongside our network of business, faith, military, and community leaders spanning from coast to coast throughout the country. We're particularly proud of our growing voice in the military and veterans community, which you are all a critical part of. We have a National Security Advisory Council that's comprised of over 200 retired 3- and 4-star general and flag officers. And then myself, my colleague Danny, we oversee our Veterans for Smart Power program. That's literally everybody else from private to 2-star. It's an initiative of over 30,000 veterans from across the country who are committed to strengthening our non-military tools of foreign policy. So what does USGLC do? What brings this diverse cross-section of America together is a firm belief in America's global leadership, and that American aid, strategic investments in diplomacy and development are essential to protecting our national security and advancing our economic interests and projecting the best of American values around the world, and that our engagement overseas matters to the American family here at home. So in DC, we advocate for a small piece of the federal budget. It's known as the International Affairs budget. This supports our diplomats and embassies and our development programs. It has a huge return on investment. For just 1% of the federal budget, we can support efforts to battle the root causes of violent extremism and instability in other countries, respond to humanitarian disasters, and tackle pandemics like COVID-19 and others, and prevent future outbreaks through strengthening global health programs. Around the country, we bring together our unique coalition to give voice to these issues around the country, urging members of Congress to support and protect the international affairs budget. We know the U.S. can't do this alone, and we need to act as a global leader by working with our friends and allies around the world to solve those global problems before they reach our shores. So I promise we're going to get the congressman introduced here in just a second, but I wanted to tell everybody off the top here that we're looking ahead to our annual State Leaders Summit for 2021. Many of you should have received a save the date for that summit that's coming up in June. If you recall, we ultimately didn't do one last year, and we were disappointed, but we are thrilled to be back in action for 2021. The State Leaders Summit is the largest, most impactful advocacy event that we conduct each year. Hundreds of veterans, community, business, and faith leaders come together from around the country to get up to speed on the latest in American foreign policy and hearing it from some of the biggest names in development and diplomacy space. People from all over the country network with other state leaders and raise their voices in the halls of Congress. This year's summit will be completely virtual, and the day of programming, the plenary sessions and the breakout sessions, those are going to take place on June 15th, which is a Tuesday, and then our virtual Hill meetings will take place on Wednesday, June 16th, with the potential to extend to the rest of the week. So if you got that save the date, please do. We're going to have a lot more to share in the coming weeks. So I just want to get this on your radar right at the top here. And for those who are new to USGLC, today's event is just going to be a taste of what you can expect in June at our State Leaders Summit. And so with that, I want to invite Dr. Zorri to deliver some brief remarks, introduce Congressman Waltz, and then we'll take it from there. So Dr. Zorri, thanks so much for being with us, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's my pleasure to introduce our very special guest today, Congressman Michael Waltz from Florida's 6th Congressional District. He has been hard at work to address the challenges of COVID-19 over the past year and working to keep America safe. Congressman Waltz has dedicated his life to public service, to his work as a Green Beret, working at the Pentagon and the White House, and now as a member of Congress, where he holds an important seat on the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman Waltz was also one of the founding members of the Four Country Caucus and was honored alongside fellow members of the caucus at the USGLC's tribute dinner in 2019. We are so honored to have the opportunity to hear from you today. Congressman, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your support of America's development and diplomacy programs. First, I'd like to ask you, how are you and your family? And second, I'd like to welcome you to say a few words before we dive into the discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Zorri, and an Air Force veteran as well. And then, so yeah, we're gonna, I guess, kick it right over to you, Congressman. If you had some opening remarks right off the top here, we'd love to hear it, and then we'll move right into the questions.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks so much. Can you hear me okay? I'll make sure I got my mute. All right,
gotcha.
Great. Well, so first of all, always great, Dr. Zorri, good to see you. And I literally was just on the call prior to this with SpaceX, talking about their expansion in Cape Canaveral. They are heading towards realistically next year a launch per week, and everything that Embry-Riddle and Daytona State has to provide. So always good to see you. I tell Embry-Riddle I probably talk about them at least every other day. Great to be on this forum, and thanks so much to all the veterans out there. I tell folks all the time that, yes, of course, thank you for your service, but at the same time, we have to keep serving. You're not done, because we did some tours overseas, and thank God, those of us who are on here obviously came back. But it's not enough. One of the reasons that I ran for office is that we have gone from a record high in the 1970s, 75% of the Congress, 3/4 were vets, and today we're hovering around 16 to 18%. And I think that explains a lot of our issues in DC, frankly, because we're missing that commonality of service on both sides of the aisle. And that's one of the reasons I co-founded the Four Country Caucus. Bottom line, if we're willing to die for the flag, we should be willing to come together, make some compromises, move the country forward. It's bipartisan, both sides of the aisle. And it's one of the reasons that one of our key pieces of legislation that I'm pushing and that caucus is pushing is getting us as a country back to national service, right? And I'm happy to talk about that as much as you want, but I'm passionate about getting our young people out. It doesn't have to be in uniform. It can be in inner city tutoring. It can be in national parks. It can be in Peace Corps, but that leadership, followership, teamwork, sense of mission, and serving something higher than and more important than yourself, and then go back out into society. I think and importantly, do it with people that don't look like you. We had that in the past, and I think we've moved away from it. We need to move back to it. Look, I think from a national security standpoint, how do we as a country and the leader of the free world deal with China, Russia, deal with great power competition, deal with rogue states, Iran, North Korea, and deal with an ongoing counterterrorism threat overlaid with 28 trillion in debt and counting? I mean, that to me is the existential question of our time. And something I certainly wrestle with, not just on Armed Services Committee, but I'm also on Science, Space, and Technology, and am the ranking Republican on the Research and Technology Committee. So with those key investments into our future, that to me is the question. I'll tell you, I don't want to go too long, but to unpack that, I do believe we are in a Cold War. with the Chinese Communist Party. They certainly are in one with us. And as a country, I believe we need to get on that footing. It's not just a whole of a government response, it's a whole of society response when we look at things that are happening in the technology space, in our universities, in our capital markets, that where the Chinese are rapidly pulling ahead and talking about openly replacing the American dream and American leadership around the world with the Chinese dream and Chinese leadership. Our development budget is critical in that effort. I've been a real advocate for that, and I will continue to be. But I'll tell you, that's not an easy place to be at all. I often refer to Mattis's quote that if you begin pulling back our diplomats and our development officers, General Mattis, when in his confirmation to be Secretary of Defense, says that means he needs to buy more ammunition. Our diplomats and development officers keep us out of wars, but they are most effective when they are backed with an effective military over their shoulder as a very credible deterrent and a very credible option. So it all works together. And then, finally, I'll just tell you from my own experience as a Green Beret, I've served all over West Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, of course. I also co-chair a women's peace and security caucus with one of the more liberal members of Congress. We don't agree on much, except for the fact that we agree that where girls are educated, where women are empowered, where women are thriving in society, in business, in politics, in societies around the world, extremism is not. And I think I can go, case in point to draw that correlation. So that said, I have to tell you, it's not easy to stand in a town hall in my district in an underprivileged neighborhood where they hit 2 potholes on the way to the town hall and their own daughters are going to schools where they aren't getting what they need, to make the case for those development daughters abroad, or those development dollars abroad that are training, other citizens or educating other citizens' daughters. We'll continue to take leadership and we'll continue to take effort. But we have to constantly draw the thread that when girls are educated abroad, our daughters are safer here at home. One of the other reasons that I was a little bit late getting on was the Biden administration just announced a full withdrawal from Afghanistan by September 11th. I think that is incredibly risky and incredibly dangerous, right to our case in point of what that means for women there, but also what that means for our safety and security here. I have some very real concerns. I think with that, I'll stop. Just to give you a taste of kind of where I stand, but I wanted to be as interactive as possible, make myself as available as possible, and to thank USGLC for your mission, and thank every veteran out there for continuing to stay engaged. We have to be with the civil military divide. We have to make these cases, not just me in a town hall, but you have to make it at the Thanksgiving table. You have to make it with your neighbors. And we have to continue to be leaders in American society until the good Lord takes us. So, all right, I really will stop this time. Back over to you.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Really appreciate that excellent opening, and we're going to drill down on quite a few of the things that you said there. From a fellow Floridian, again, I just want to say thanks for taking the time to be with us here today. So yeah, you touched on this a bit, but I'll frame it in the book you wrote, Warrior Diplomat, highlights your service as both a Green Beret and a counterterrorism advisor at the White House. You've had several years now to see things from the congressional perspective as well. So drawing on your experiences at the intersection of defense and diplomacy, could you share how it is that you came to view the importance of our civilian tools as complements to the military in advancing our national security agenda? How do they work hand in hand?
Yeah, well, at the macro level, our diplomacy is bolstered when we have as I was saying, when we have a credible military deterrent. And I don't think I just don't think there's a broad and full understanding of kind of how deterrence, that old peace through strength mantra truly does play out. Out on the global stage. I've seen time and time again, both from a Washington perspective, but then also out on the ground, that oftentimes these authoritarian regimes, whether it's IRGC, whether it's the Taliban, I can kind of walk around the globe, are emboldened by when they perceive strength as weakness. They are emboldened, and they're deterred by strength, and they're deterred by costs that they believe that will be imposed on them, and that kind of model has led the world to its longest period of global prosperity since World War II. So that's at the macro level. At the tactical level, I mean, we are absolutely reliant. We are not, a lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne isn't trained to run a town, to restore electricity, right? To handle all of those other skills. At the same time, what I saw is our skill sets are sitting in our civilian agencies, but they're often hamstrung, and it's our military that can get out and about, right? And particularly in a non-permissive or a hostile environment. So in many ways, we aren't organized as a government to really be able to do what we need to do in a lot of these places. One kind of bridging element is the National Guard and Reserves. We're the only entity that brings, that has former sheriffs. I had a sergeant that was an executive at a telecommunications company, that brings all those other skill sets, but can also, shoot a rifle and get out and about. One of the legislate, and then, how does that translate to me legislatively? Well, one of the things that I'm working on right now is getting our diplomats and getting our development officers out of the wire. And what we're finding is, they cannot do their jobs within the four walls of their embassy. And how do we get this kind of risk aversion? How do we get zero defect, zero risk mentality, out of our diplomatic corps that frankly, I think has set in over the last couple of decades. So that's how I try to bring all of those perspectives. That's an example of what we can do legislatively to try to address it and try to make it more effective.
Good deal. Thank you. You again, something that you touched on in your opening remarks and just now, we'll bring it back to China. They've really ramped up their economic engagement, not just in Africa. I mean, the story has been Africa for a while, but it's Latin America now too. And, they recently surpassed the US as Brazil's top trading partner.
That's right.
So you've frequently spoken out on the need for the US to remain competitive with China. And doing so will require using all the tools at our disposal, including development and diplomacy. So for you, what are the costs of ceding ground to competitors like China, especially in developing countries? And how can we better leverage our strategic advantages in this competition, such as our network of allies in the Indo-Pacific, to advance US interests here at home and abroad?
Well, I'll give you, I always find examples kind of bring it home rather than these kind of ethereal jargony responses that are so popular in DC. Case in point, I was in Panama pre-COVID, and the Chinese now can control, should they choose to, both sides of the Panama Canal. That is absolutely critical from our naval strategy standpoint if we need to surge into the Pacific. And they didn't do it militarily; they didn't have to. They bought into one of the distressed ports, got a controlling interest, state subsidized, basically dropped the prices to zero for the commercial cost of using that port, put the other ports out of business, and then bought them up, right? To the point where while I was down there, one of our frigates wanted to, at least as I was told, needed to stop in for repairs and was denied. So that's just a case in point. Another, through their debt diplomacy in Argentina, gave the Argentine government, the previous government, loans that they couldn't afford to pay back and took back in collateral as a mountain range. Okay. Well, now they have a space tracking station on it that is perfectly in line with our polar launches out of Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. And that is magnified across the globe. So what do we do about it? Well, I was just in Central Command for briefings, and they're doing this around the world with ports, with grids, with key terrain, as they expand their presence in space, on both sides of the Suez Canal as well, and buying into those free trade zones. So they are using economic tools to seize critical terrain that has key military applications. And, CENTCOM, we have a lot of military tools, Central Command in the region, but we don't have necessarily those diplomatic and economic tools. What we do have, though, we need to develop those, and that's a longer conversation. But what we do have also, though, is our values, and why that's so important as we engage with countries diplomatically, and point to cases where Chinese have caused environmental destruction wherever they've engaged, do not abide by even the very basics of labor practices, bring in their own labor, bribe often officials, which is not in line with, obviously, with good governance. And we're starting to see a shift. We're starting to see a number of countries push back against this kind of bad behavior. So, but that takes ongoing diplomatic engagement. That takes a real focus, and we need some economic tools that we can compete with and that we can push back with.
Absolutely. So again, this is something that you touched on a little bit in your opening remarks. And with this news about Afghanistan, we'll probably put this question in a different light, but women, peace, and security. You're as you mentioned, the co-chair of the Women, Peace, and Security Caucus, which aims to advance the role of women being in more peaceful societies around the world. And the UN has found that women's participation in peace negotiations dramatically increases the probability of lasting success, which frankly seems like kind of a no-brainer to me. But women have made up only 6% of signatories on major peace processes since 1992, and they're 50% of the population. So how does you do the math? So what does inclusion of women lead, why does it lead to more success outcomes? And how has legislation like Women, Peace, and Security Act helped to improve women's participation around the world?
Yeah, sure. So before I go to that, just last piece on Belt and Road, on China and the economic piece. Part of what I'm working to do, and others, we have a China task force in the House, is we're funding much of it through both their military buildup and their capital for debt diplomacy around the world is coming from Wall Street. Not only direct investments, but their ability to raise capital in our markets is coming from our trade deficit, and is coming even from our own pension funds. I led an effort along with some others to stop the military's thrift savings plan. So here's our military retirement plan investing into Beijing, where they then use that capital to compete with and surpass the United States. So there's not only our tools, it's I think taking a different look at basically how they're using money to further their ends. On the women's peace and security piece, number one, in Afghanistan, the process that the State Department is pushing is for the Afghan government to dissolve its parliament, dissolve its government, and then create a power sharing agreement with the Taliban. Of note, the current Afghan constitution, which would also be dissolved under this arrangement, allocates 25% of parliamentary seats for women. so that they are effectively represented. And that is a huge, huge leap forward, I think, for the Afghan government to be representative of its society. Women are, I've seen personally, the brutalization of women before. I've seen a girls' school machine gunned and set on fire with the girls in it. I've seen women with acid thrown on me, just the brutalization. So we can never go back to that. And I do think women would suffer the most under this construct. And I have a real issue with the United States pushing this construct. Number one. Number two, to your point, those are great statistics and ones that I cite often. We just had a forum with 4 of the Afghan female negotiators that are part of the process. They have very real concerns, and they have concerns that, should we push this power sharing agreement, which would likely, the Taliban have committed to include women, but then they have a caveat under the construct of Islamic law and Sharia law. That gives me real pause, gives them real pause of what this looks like going forward. So and I'm sure many of the veterans on this call want nothing more than U.S. troops to be able to come home from Afghanistan. But on the other hand, we have to protect our gains there. And we have to, from a counterterrorism standpoint, we need to fight away games, not home games. Right. I just have very real concerns about what this means for women. To your broader picture, look, women bring a different perspective, and they bring an important perspective. And one of the other issues that to the negotiating table, but to governing. And one of the things that I pushed when we were on operations was for the female engagement teams that allowed us to engage 50% of the Afghan populace. And that meant having a construct where women were coming along with us on our various missions. So there's just benefit across the board from the most macro level to the tactical level.
I want to thank you for addressing that. I can tell you, I mean, just in my experience, that military veterans, especially, sort of obviously ones who served post 9/11 in Afghanistan, are really, really engaged on this issue. We had an event on this, I think, back in December, where we talked specifically about women in the Afghan peace process. So thank you very much for addressing that. At this point, I want to bring in a couple of other folks to ask a question or two of you. I think one of them is even a constituent. I love it. We will we'll first bring up on screen Captain David Allen, U.S. Coast Guard, retired, my good friend, and he's got a question for you. So if you can take yourself off mute and put yourself on video, Captain, we would love to hear from you.
Great. Can you hear me, Sean?
Got you loud and clear.
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Congressman, thank you for joining us today. As Sean mentioned, I'm a constituent of yours, but I also am a 30-year veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard, where we had an opportunity to work with our international partners on law enforcement, drug interdiction, and migrant interdiction as well. I also served as the senior defense official at the U.S. Embassy in Port-au-Prince, and I understand how a lot of our State Department people are very much, every bit as dedicated as some of our military people serving overseas too. So yep. Hopefully a lot of these efforts to recognize military and improve their condition will extend to State Department diplomatic missions. But today I'm calling you from the VA Medical Center in Orlando, Lake Nona. Beautiful facility here, and I'm actually looking forward to the VA clinic that's being built in Daytona Beach and updated.
Hey. All right, we're getting there.
My question has to do with medical care, specifically with the Toxic Exposure in the Military Act, TMAC, which was introduced by one of your colleagues, Gus Bilirakis, also from Florida, last session, and has been carried over into this session. If you have the information, can you update us on the status of the TMAC and whether you plan on coming on board as one of the co-sponsors of that act?
Yeah. So first, yeah, I love my coasties. Good to hear from you, Captain Allen. Actually, when we go to the State of the Union, we're allowed to bring one guest. And frankly, much to my family's a little bit of their chagrin, but I said I have to bring. I brought the senior chief from the Coast Guard station at Ponce Inlet as my guest to the State of the Union because unfortunately at that time the government was partially shut down over border wall funding, but it affected Coast Guard pay under DHS. And I thought the least we could do was to get was to recognize the great contributions of our Coast Guard. And it's not, it's fantastic in terms of interdiction, dealing with migrant flows, dealing with drug interdiction. But I think there's a real role for them for the Coast Guard in the Pacific as well. We're looking to expand that. And I'm also fighting hard for more icebreakers up in the Arctic. And what's going on in the Arctic right now, frankly, is scary with the opening in the Northwest Passage, with the Russian military buildup, with the Chinese pushing over into the top of Canada. That's a whole other conversation. But I think the Coast Guard's going to just continue to have a key role. I'll be candid. I need to let me talk to Congressman Bill Arakis and get smarter on legislatively where the status of the bill. I know that he worked with some of our delegation on trying to get NDAA language in last year. I think part of it went through, but part of it did not. So oftentimes you introduce these bills as standalone, gain support, and then tag them onto a piece of legislation that's actually going to move. One of the reasons that I love being on Armed Services Committee is it's about the only thing that's almost guaranteed to get all the way through, frankly, the dysfunction that we often find here. But I'll get smarter on it and I'll communicate. I'll get your information and I'll communicate that back through my team in Florida.
Captain Allen, thanks so much for your question. And now we're going to bring up Colonel Margaret Cope, U.S. Air Force retired. So we're all stacked with those sixes here, including the congressman. So. And Colonel Cope, if you're able to unmute yourself and your video, there you go. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Good afternoon, Congressman Waltz. Thank you so much for your comments. And when you were speaking about national service and gender equity, it was music to my ears. I would love to speak with you and your staff about a framework that's been developed that would facilitate and probably garner some bipartisan support. So, but I really want to thank you for your support for diplomacy in our alliances.
Mm-hmm.
We all know how important that is.
Yep.
When 9/11 happened, I was serving at Scott Air Force Base at Headquarters Air Mobility Command, and our strong NATO alliances facilitated the use of critical equipment to the military, the Air Force, when our aircraft were also deployed at Frankfurt Airport, International Airport, and mine was on the other side at that time, where we staged the C-17s before they deployed down theater.
Yep.
So this arrangement was fabulous. And when we develop and nurture these relationships, we develop trust and facilitate our global response. As our nation responds to the pandemic with public health measures and gets vaccinated, why is it critical that coordinating with our allies to address the pandemic, and not only just to protect the vulnerable, but also to our own citizens?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I think, and so I also, let me pause. Not getting that out the way I want. 100% agreement on the criticality of our alliances. Number one. Number two, I just took over as the vice chair of the India American caucus here in the House, because I think that is perhaps the most critical alliance moving forward. in the 21st century as we deal with the growing threat that is the CCP. And I just want to say, just as a caveat, I very deliberately say the Chinese Communist Party, no issue at all with the beautiful, amazing, historic Chinese culture and people. It's their government that oppresses them, frankly, as much as they show aggressiveness around the world. But that Quad alliance, India, Japan, Australia, the United States, and then I would add in a very important South Korea, is absolutely critical moving forward. And to your point on pandemics, one, we learn from each other. We learned a lot in the initial days of the pandemic from my fiance was on the COVID task force at the time. And we learned a lot from the South Korean response. We learned a lot from the Taiwanese response. That was one of the early drivers to immediately shut down travel from China. They had learned a lot, frankly, from the last pandemic that came out of China and in the SARS outbreak in 2009, and then we were able to learn very quickly from them. But look, I think the quickest answer is, as long as our economy is so interwoven, and it absolutely will be, then we need to work together in terms of a global response. I mean, we've seen how quickly things can spread around the world with an interwoven economy and a knowledge-based economy. But for example, how it hits home in Florida. Orlando is the largest tourist destination for Europeans in the world. Nearly 100 million a year. That's a third of the population of the United States flow through there. So not only does that have a huge economic impact, very close to home for me, but obviously from a global health standpoint, take that a step further. The vast majority of our critical minerals, many of our foodstuffs, everything from cocoa to coffee beans, comes from South Central America. It comes from Africa. Florida's 14 ports imports a third of America's food supply, especially during the winter months. I mean, I can go on and on about how interwoven this is. And when, I think we have to really do a lot of hard thinking and a lot of hard work to be better prepared going forward. Fortunately, our global supply chains were only partially interrupted. I think toilet paper was the one that really made the headlines, but we were watching the ports very closely. We were watching global shipping very closely. We just saw what happened just with a minor interruption relatively in the Suez Canal. And if those had been shut down, we would have been in a very, very different place here in the United States. So, every one of those issues, our ability to access critical minerals, our ability to access gloves and masks, are dependent on the global supply chain. And if a future pandemic really truly affects that in a devastating way, that's something that we have to be prepared for.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Colonel Cope, thank you very much. That was a great question.
Great question. Yeah, thank you.
Congressman, I know that you've got to go right at 12:50 to be on your way to an in-person meeting. So I've got one more question for you here at the end. And for everybody else, after the Congressman departs, I would encourage you to please stay on. I'd like to get some feedback from you. But we've got some people who are with us on the call here today who are very steeped in these issues. They have experience. They worked on them for years. And then there's others, and there's other veterans around the country who maybe aren't as familiar with it. But my question is this, and you touched on it a little before. Why should military veterans of every rank and every service period stay engaged on America's role in the world? And why is it that they should share their experiences from the military, sort of executing on our national security strategy with their fellow countrymen? What is it? What is the duty that you think is there, and how do you think that the broader American public benefits from veterans speaking out on these issues?
Yeah, well, first of all, and I mean, this is not partisan at all. I am actively recruiting, and if you're of a different political persuasion, I have folks I can plug you into to veterans to be engaged politically. I think that will actually help tremendously with the partisanship that we're seeing in our political system, and that doesn't have to be in Washington, D.C. Really, where the rubber meets the road in terms of governing is in your county commissions, in your state legislatures, and with your mayors. So please continue to think about, there are other ways to serve besides wearing a uniform. Serve your neighbor, serve your community, serve your country. But how do we imbue, for whatever reason, it was under many of our skin to do it in an early age. But how do we imbue that back into American society again? And I'll tell you, I mean, right now, obviously, the elephant in the room is the racial and policing issues that we're working through as a country. Where getting us back to national service really came home to me was in a conversation with a World War II veteran who came from the segregated South, and essentially told me he had never really had an extensive conversation with a person of color, where he grew up in North Florida. And then he finds himself at 19 years old, his bunkmate in the Navy is a Black man, and they became lifelong friends. That kind of forcing function we're really missing, and I'm determined to get us back to that. But that doesn't have to sit around and wait on national legislation for me in Washington, D.C. I think we can do that organically, and we need to, those basic skills of leadership, followership, teamwork, are not necessarily imbued. Civic education is not imbued. According to recent polling, 75% of high school graduates cannot name the 3 branches of government after graduation. That's a real problem. 70% are unfit to do the very basics of joining the military if we had to go to a national emergency and if we did have to go back to a draft. So, that's why I'm so, I carve out time almost as much as I can for USGLC, because it's a mechanism for veterans and for those who have served to continue to engage on these issues. So, my message is when I walk into a VFW, I tell them, hey guys, sitting around here at the bar telling war stories ain't gonna cut it. What are you doing out in the community? And then how do we, if you're not inclined to help me, then roll up your sleeves and get engaged yourself, right? And we have to, we can't, it's relatively cheap and easy to yell at the television and post on social media and argue with your relatives at Thanksgiving, right? Figure out ways to roll up your sleeves and get engaged. That's as blunt as I can be, right? The country needs us, and with such a small percentage serving now, that means they need us that much more, because they need that ethos that we bring of for country and mission first.
Congressman Waltz, thank you very much for that fantastic advice. Thank you for your time, for your service, your continued leadership. And we look forward to staying engaged with you and your colleagues going forward. So thank you so much for coming on.